I am Sam Pryor, the president of Plato. Do we have anybody here who is not a member of Plato? Oh, we do? Very few. All right, let me just tell you very, very briefly who we are. We are an organization composed of over 400 members, many of whom are retired, but quite a few are still working part-time or even full-time. And what distinguishes us is our love for learning. But we do it not in the format of lectures, but in the format of small peer-led discussion groups. We really have, and I think everyone who's a member would agree, an extraordinary community of people who love learning, but who love to share their insights and their excitement with others. So on that note, I would like to introduce Richard Adler, the former chair of the colloquium. Our current chair, Jay Ratkow, is out of town because his wife scheduled the trip without taking into account that he had a colloquium today. So thank you for
Thank you, Sam, and I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm Richard Adler. As Sam just explained, Jay Ratkow, our colloquium chair, couldn't be with us today, so I returned to the podium, reprising a role that I thought I had left in 2017. And all of you are welcome here today. I want to give a special thank you to my son-in-law, Brian Bloom, who's in the back of the room over there. He took time off from his busy computer service business to video this event. Brian is the husband of Carrie Bloom, our youngest Plato member. And Brian is a last-minute fill-in for videographer Bill Clarkson. Okay, in terms of coming attractions, on February 20, Thursday, February 20, which is the third Thursday in February, our Plato colloquium speaker will be Professor David Bennett from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. He will review nativism throughout American history, from anti-Catholic sentiment when the nation was first formed through the times of President Wilson and Henry Adams to the present, and he will examine how nativist views have always found an audience. And this brings me to Professor Richard Sander. He was born in Washington, D.C. He spent most of his childhood in small towns in northwest Indiana. After receiving his bachelor degree in 1978 from Harvard, he, like Barack Obama, worked as a community organizer in Southside Chicago. Sander worked on the election effort and subsequent transition team of Harold Washington, Chicago's first black mayor, which reminds me of one of my pieces of advice from my mother, who was born and raised in Chicago. And she was many times telling me that Chicago is a great place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. Just saying. In 1983, he began graduate school at Northwestern University, receiving his law degree in 1988 and a PhD in economics in 1990. And right there, that separates him from 99.9% of lawyers. Most lawyers that I know don't even know how to spell economics, let alone come up with these theories. So he's really, really different. In 1989, he joined the faculty at UCLA School of Law. Next thing that happens is in 1996, California voters approved Proposition 209, banning the use of race in various government programs, including admissions at the University of California. You see, admission programs, particularly affirmative action admission programs at law schools, brings me to Professor Sanders' most controversial 2004 Law Review article, which was in the Stanford Law Review, and a 2012 book entitled Mismatch. The subtitle of Mismatch is How Affirmative Action Hurts Students It's Intended to Help and Why Universities Won't Admit It. And I was talking to him earlier, and I could easily tell him why the universities won't admit it, but I'll save that for last. The story told in Professor Stander's book begins in the early 1970s, when universities first began granting racial preferences in a noble effort to jumpstart racial integration. University leaders touted a strict party line about these preferences, that every student who received the preferences was fully qualified to succeed at the school, and that the effects of the preferences were overwhelmingly positive. Partly because of his training in economics and statistics, Professor Sander was soon asked to be a technical advisor to the UC's admission committee. After analyzing the data from the committee, he learned that there indeed was a stark difference between the participation levels of various racial groups. Sander began to believe that his discoveries were manifestations of a concept that economist Thomas Sowell has dubbed the mismatch effect, where affirmative action devolved into a patently unfair system of quotas and concealment. In 2006, in order to gain further research information regarding his mismatch theory, Professor Sander requested the California Bar to release its stored data of bar exam scores, grade point averages, and LSAT scores, including race and gender information. The Bar denied his request based on privacy grounds. Now, in discussing this with Professor Sander, I thought he had won that case, but evidently not. So at this juncture, we still don't have the information, right? Yeah, we don't have the information. But I thought that he won. But wishful thinking, I suppose. When Mismatch first appeared in 2004, the public perception was hostile. Law reviews published over a dozen critiques. Not a single one of these articles even conceded that Sander had identified an important and potentially serious problem. Professor Sander describes most of these critics as sneeringly dismissive. Some critics, like Slate magazine, questioned his mental acuity, as in an article entitled, I love this article, "Sanding Down Sander, the debunker of affirmative action gets debunked." Professor Sander is married to astrophysicist Fiona Harrison, has 2 children, and he lives in the Los Feliz area. It's quite a drive to work, don't think about it. Finally, I want to speak about Professor Sander's integrity and courage in the face of an entrenched bureaucracy. As a Superior Court judge for over 32 years, I know what it feels like when you advance ideas that question the assumptions of past administrations. Back in the early 90s, I proposed running Ethernet cable in the courthouse, adopting an email program, and putting our jury instructions in a computer program. My colleagues and the court's IT department laughed at me and dismissed my ideas. Today, not only are courthouses wired and using email, but Thomson Reuters sells my jury instruction program. So here's how Professor Sander explains his stand against the odds from his own words in the preface to Mismatch. He says, "I was struck again and again by the way strongly held beliefs about public policy could blind people on all sides of important issues to the actual state of affairs. Otherwise, smart and honest people often screened out inconvenient facts or felt that acknowledging weakness in their position only gave aid and comfort to their opponents. I saw this while serving as board president of a large fair housing organization when some of my colleagues were reluctant to confront and address obvious cases of corruption or incompetence because to do so would embarrass the movement." And I think the key words in that quote are screened out inconvenient facts. And that's what I meant earlier when I said that I could tell him why the administration at UC wouldn't cooperate. It's what I call the iron law of bureaucracy. There are 2 iron laws. And this is an answer to your question why they wouldn't wait. Iron law number 1. When you're a strong bureaucrat, never let the facts interfere with a strong feeling. The second iron law is being a strong bureaucrat means never having to say you're sorry. They never said they were sorry, right? Okay, which brings me in recognition of Professor Sanders' courage, former UCLA professor Tim Grosclose, who's now at the George Mason University. Professor Grosclose says that Professor Sanders is one man who told the truth. Grosclose quotes Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who once said, "One man who stopped lying could bring down a tyranny." Although admissions policy is not quite a tyranny, it is surrounded by much deceit. Professor Grosclose says, quote, "In standing up to the deceit, one man has been more important and courageous than all the others. His name is Richard Sanders." Now, before I turn this over to Professor Sanders, I just wanted to say one word about asking questions. The key word is questions. So we don't want to have statements, and I know you're going to want to get in your personal opinions, but we need to have just questions. So with that in mind, Professor Sanders.
Yeah. So, thank you very much for having me. And appreciate all the efforts of Jane to bring this off. So, before I start, did any of you know Bill and Kenny McGovern? Bill and Kenny McGovern? Yeah. Bill was a colleague of mine who after he retired, became actually a Plato. So I've been hearing about Bill McGovern. So everybody knows him, right?
Yes.
Passed away last year. Katie just moved to Massachusetts. Peter heard of her. Okay. I'm not filling you in. I'm going to show a lot of data in this, so I hope your eyes don't glaze over. I'm going to walk around so that I can kind of explain things and interact with the charts I'm showing you. These were assembled from a few different places, so forgive the kind of chaotic changes in format as you go from slide to slide. So I got into this in the 90s. I generally am I am viewed as a liberal on most issues, and most of my time these days goes to working on the problem of housing segregation. I'm vice chair of a group, a national group that tries to foster housing desegregation strategies. Some of those involve thinking about race and crafting solutions. So I don't have a philosophical problem with racial preferences, certainly not with affirmative action. And I do think, I want to be clear that I think that the sort of unwillingness to confront facts are problems that exist across the ideological spectrum. But it's also the case, I think, that in academia we have developed in law schools, for example, such a concentration of ideological cohesion that it has created an environment that's very hostile to any kind of facts or any kind of solutions. Generally higher in these low ranges where students were not mismatched. But if they came in with a really large preference that put them up here, then there was going to be a large mismatch effect. Another way of getting at this issue was to compare students who were offered admission to two different schools and either went to the more elite school they were offered admission to or a less elite school. And this is a kind of complicated table, but I think the most important takeaway I'd like to point out is that here we found that students who went to a slightly less elite school had a substantially higher bar passage rate. And when we sort of took what we had predicted for the mismatch theory, the gap between these two was even larger than what we had predicted. So that our mismatch estimates were actually underestimates based on the best data that we could find. Now this is different. So I've been talking about law schools. This is data on undergraduates. And this table is really illustrating more what I call competition mismatch. The law school story I just told you was mainly, I think, about learning mismatch. Because once you're in law school, there's no issue of transferring to like an easier program. You're in law school and you're going to have to take the bar eventually, almost always. But as an undergraduate, you can be mobile across fields. And what this chart shows is what your odds are of completing a science major that you start with, depending on how your SAT score, your SAT math score compares to that of your classmates. And so this we can think of as the middle. And the idea is that if your SAT score is 75 points higher than that of your classmates, you have higher odds of actually sticking with the program and graduating. And the effect is even higher here, right? Whereas conversely, if you're 150 points below the median, you have a much lower chance of persisting and getting that science degree. Now, an important point of this is that this line is where the Asians came out on average, the Asian Americans. These lines covered whites and underrepresented minorities, African Americans and Hispanics. And what you can see is these two lines are so close together that they almost look like one line. This goes to my point that this mismatch effect is not about race, it's about your relative position in the class. You see? These outcomes, the Asian outcomes are higher, and it might be related to the fact that a large proportion are immigrant students, that their English skills are on average weaker, so they have less ability to move into humanities areas instead of science. I don't know, it could be a variety of things. But I think the important point that really strikes me is that 90% of the students were white or underrepresented minorities, and for them, there was no racial effect. Let's see, I talked a lot about this. This is a social mismatch idea. I mentioned the Duke study. There was an Air Force Academy study where the leaders of the Air Force Academy concluded that based on some informal observation, that if you paired students who were struggling with students who were doing really well, that would really help the struggling students to do better. And so they approached some economists and decided to do an experiment where they assigned people to freshman roommates and deliberately created big disparities in some cases and smaller disparities in others in terms of people's academic credentials. And they mixed it up enough so that the race by itself wasn't predicting those things. It was based on academic distance. And what they found was that if students were, scholars concluded the weak experimental students had formed study networks among themselves, shutting off the effect of the stronger students and increasing the isolation of the intended beneficiaries. So the scholars who did the study were honest enough to publish their results and said, we were shocked. We were pretty sure that this was going to show a really valuable form of academic support. But it turns out that the academic distance is large, that it has a counterproductive effect. It ends up increasing isolation instead of reducing it. Oops. These effects also persist long after law school. So one of my colleagues, who was in administration when we had this conversation, had an unusual moment of candor and said, well, Rick, even if this is causing people to pass the bar at much higher rate, fail the bar at much higher rates, I still favor these large preferences because in the long term, having a UCLA degree is better than having a Loyola degree, and that's that. So one of the projects I did got some data from a school that had tracked people over their careers. and looked at the rate at which they became partners in a firm that they started with. And it's sorted here by what decile GPA they had. So in other words, like that chart I showed you a while ago, decile 1 would be people who were in the bottom 10 of their class, decile 10 would be people who were in the top 10. And to avoid mixing race and the academic effects, this chart is only looking at white students. So students who had really high grades were more likely to get jobs in big firms, in big law firms. And any of you who are lawyers knows how that works, right? The big firms strongly take into account your academic performance in law school. But what was striking is that even though they were being hired at much larger rates, they also had much higher rates of being promoted. So even though it was a bigger pool, their promotion rate was much higher. So the number of those who actually became partners was dramatically higher than at the bottom of the GPA distribution. So the fact that these numbers go up is telling us that that the law firms are much more likely to make someone a partner who had strong academic performance in law school. Which I think is great news for law professors, because that means that we're actually doing something. You know, when people learn in our classes and they do well on their tests, that actually makes them better lawyers, more likely to succeed. It's a crude measure of success, but you know, if you think about it, it's hard to come up with strong measures of success, and this is I think a pretty persuasive one. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know about law school, but do you think less elite law schools provide more support for their less performing students?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well,
Than elite schools?
in other words, they have better academic support. The question is, do less elite schools have better academic support? Law schools. I haven't seen any evidence of that. They're what's striking. There's a professor named Ted Liu at Loyola who actually did a nice study, and he found that if you took strong students and some of them went to Loyola and some of them went to more elite school, Loyola students were much more likely to become partners. And he thought maybe that has to do with some sort of the people who choose the less elite schools, or maybe it just has to do with the fact that they get really good grades when they go to Loyola instead of having sort of middling performance somewhere else. Anyway, we can come back to that later. Now let's talk about socioeconomic diversity. So, at a typically elite college in 2000, there were about 25 students from the top quartile of the SES distribution for every one student from the bottom quartile. Do you know what I mean by that? SES, socioeconomic status, what we're doing is we're taking, in this study, we took a combination of people's parents, the educational achievement of their parents, and the occupation of their parents. And we gave them a socioeconomic score based on the eliteness of those factors. And the score would go from 0 to 100. And we then figured out what proportion of students were in the top quartile of the US population, what proportion were in the bottom quartile. So this is saying that the elites are overrepresented at law school. Well, this is undergraduate, isn't it? Yeah, this is an elite undergraduate college by a 25-to-1 ratio. Now, law schools, that ratio is even higher. And that means that there's very little socioeconomic diversity. It means there are very few students at these colleges who are growing up in an environment of poverty. There's a lot of talk about racial underrepresentation, but when we discuss that, people are usually shocked by an underrepresentation of, say, 2 to 1, versus this is 25 to 1. So it suggests that not paying attention to SES at all really does produce kind of an economic segregation of people across types of schools. Another way of looking at this is to say, well, if you control for someone's characteristics when they're a senior in high school, what's the likelihood that they'll go to a particular college or go to college at all? And it turns out that African Americans, although they're underrepresented in college somewhat, are overrepresented in four-year colleges when you control for their demography and especially their high school performance and their test scores. Whereas students in the bottom quartile of the socioeconomic distribution are pretty dramatically underrepresented. And this is giving similar data for law students. So in law school, the top quartiles are represented by a factor of 82 relative to the bottom quartile. I guess I can make an aside here. So in 1996, when California passed Prop 209, I and a colleague of mine named David Slansky proposed to the faculty that we move to a socioeconomic system of preferences. And we started using those preferences. And partly because no one else in the country was doing that, we found we could get a lot of socioeconomic diversity and still get very strong students. We didn't have to use very large preferences. So the student body that came in had like 5 times as many students in the class who were the first of their families to go to college, let alone law school. And that class also turned out to have the highest bar passage rate of any class in UCLA's history, either before or after we had started other programs. 91% passing rate. And it was a great experience in the classroom to be able to say, okay, so anyone here know a carpenter? You know, there's a case here involving a carpenter's union, you know, and hands would actually go up. After a year or two, the faculty basically said, well, this is not producing enough racial diversity, so we're going to kill the program. That's pretty much stuff we talked about. So let's talk about the rest of the University of California. So again, 96, Prop 209 is passed. The university is prohibited from using race in admissions. And the initial reaction of the university is to mostly honor that. I was in committees convened by the UC president. We met in Oakland, we talked about campus-wide policies. And there was some discussion of cheating, but the general view was, let's see what we can do within this rule. And the university changed some things that it was doing. So 97 was the last year that they were able to use preferences. 98 was the first year of the post-preference regime. What you can see is that African-American applications were very flat during that time. And Hispanic applications were pretty flat as well. They were going up a little bit, but the Hispanic population of California was rising very rapidly during that time. The school, when it had racial preferences, in my view, was basically just kind of not worried about recruiting people. They just thought we can use whatever size preference we need to achieve the amount of racial diversity that we want. But after Prop 209, they said we've actually got to do outreach. And they set up programs. They ended up spending a couple $100 million in programs to try to reach into high schools in Central City neighborhoods, set up mentoring programs, set up programs so people knew more what the AG requirements were at the University of California, which for a lot of inner city students are kind of exotic. And they got dramatic results. The number of African American applicants went up by 50% between 98 and 2006. And the number of Hispanic applicants almost doubled. So it went up some for other groups too, but those were by far the most dramatic changes. So the effect of Prop 209 was to increase, not decrease, the degree to which Hispanics and African Americans were coming to the University of California. Another incidental benefit that I would ascribe to these efforts was that graduation rates went up pretty dramatically. Look what happens to the African American and Hispanic graduation rates over the first 10 years of this Prop 209 effort. It's pretty amazing. Enrollment also goes up. It takes a little longer. There's an initial drop in African American enrollment from 97 to 98. That was concentrated at Berkeley and UCLA, which was what the press paid pretty much exclusive attention to. And no attention was paid to the fact that it was increasing at the other 6 campuses, that they were becoming much more diverse than they'd been before, and that by 2006, African American and Hispanic enrollment was rising everywhere. If you look at 2013, you see those numbers continue to go up. The problem is that around 2006, the university decided that despite all the improvements that had happened since Prop 209, they were tired of being constrained by that. And one campus after another, in my view, started introducing covert racial preferences. The hardest evidence for this is that partly through the efforts of Tim Grosclose, we mentioned before, who was on the UC Admissions Committee when they reinstituted preferences. UCLA was sort of courted into hiring a premier sociologist named Robert Mayer, a strong supporter of racial preferences, to do a study of admissions for 2007 through 2012, the first 5 years of the new regime. And he found, documented in detail, that the effect of the system was to exclude 241 Asian Americans from admission in 2007, who would have qualified if strictly race-neutral criteria were used. And there were 80 students excluded who were Southeast Asian, with increases in African American and Latino populations. And an increase, there was no slight negative for whites, but not very important. So it was pretty clear that UCLA was cheating on Prop 209. And instead of sort of coming down on the university, the regents and the president basically had a series of meetings in 2011 and said, we insist that every other campus do what UCLA is doing. They didn't say, we insist that you all start cheating on Prop 209. They said, we insist that you use UCLA's holistic admissions process. So, the mismatch work that I did, and a lot of the tables that I've showed you, were possible because there was a fair degree of inquiry into things like the racial gap in bar passage in the 1990s and early 2000s. These were topics that could be discussed. After my article appeared, law schools, there was about a 6-month period where there was a lot of turmoil and discussion at law schools, and then it was like a trap door shut, and the information was cut off. The biggest mistake that I made in working this whole issue was that I should have asked the California Bar for its data on outcomes before publishing my article. Because there are 2 psychometricians at the bar who I had been talking about this for a couple of years. They totally got it, they were totally supportive. They signed letters to the head of the bar urging that the data be made available to me. Or if there was a privacy concern, that they study the data with input from me and create a public report. And, you know, I think in 2003 that would have been an easy sell. But by 2006 that had become a subject of war. There were a dozen California law school deans who all wrote a letter to the bar saying, please don't give Sandra any access to this information. With no real reasons given, just kind of, you know, ritualistic invocations of privacy concerns. So one concrete way of measuring this is that right after I started working on this, I sent out FOIA requests to law schools all around the country. And about 56% of them sent me their admissions data when I asked in the mid-2000s. 6 or 7 years later, I asked again, and it was 13% who provided responses. Same laws, often the same administrators, just a different attitude towards what transparency meant. In the California Bar case, we worked for 2 years with the bar to try to persuade them to disclose the data. They finally didn't. We filed suit, and we did win initially. We got a unanimous verdict in the California Supreme Court that said that there is a public interest in knowing what this data is. And Sandra has a right to it as long as it can be plowed in a way that has reasonable measures to protect privacy. But we drew a judge at the lower court level who was just incredibly hostile to us. And she wrote her opinion in a way that she was smart enough to write an opinion that was pretty much appeal-proof. So we didn't get that out. I've sued the University of California twice for data on their admissions. I won in 2014 and got extensive law school and medical school data. I'm in the middle of a suit right now for undergraduate data. And basically, you know, this is a really interesting story, I think. In 2007, when, you know, my work was well known in legal circles, but not that well known among undergraduate colleges, I put together a team of 6 economists, and we jointly wrote a letter to the UC president asking for a database on student applications and outcomes from 1992 to 2006. We said what we want to do is study what the effect of Prop 209 was. See if we can look for evidence of, say, mismatch or other things. And there was about a year of negotiation, but they finally gave us 95% of the data that we wanted. About a dozen major articles came out of that. Unfortunately, most of them were not written by me, but these other economists wrote some terrific articles that appeared in places like the American Economic Review. In 2017, we conferred and we thought, you know, it'd be really interesting to see what's happened since 2006 because a long time's gone by, there's all this evidence, the preferences are back. We can sort of see if the return of preferences is connected to declines in student performance. And we sent the request. We heard nothing for a long time. Finally, the request was denied. We said, well, we would give them the data as researchers with kind of a confidentiality agreement. That was considered for 2 or 3 months, and then I called the guy in charge of it. He said, he was very embarrassed. He said, you'll know within a week, but he never wrote to me. So we finally filed suit, and that suit's still ongoing. But something that we learned just a few weeks ago is that while the suit was in progress, they gave all the data that we wanted and more to a Berkeley professor who hated the mismatch theory and who has now drafted an article with secret data that he won't share with anyone, arguing that, all the conclusions these guys drew before were wrong. There's no way to tell because you can't see his data. The university didn't want to tell us about this, but it turns out that they've made similar data disclosures to 35 other people and institutions. So I'm hoping that our judge will find that to be a good reason why we should get the data too. One of the things that this earlier research we did showed was that in the sciences, for example, if you just looked at African Americans, Hispanics, and American Indians, there was a pretty sharp increase after Prop 209 in the number of people getting bachelor's degrees and graduation rates of those students. This was concrete evidence that again, Prop 209 in those early years when race neutrality was actually followed by the university was having very positive effects for minority students. Let's see. I probably talked long enough. There are more things I could talk about, but why don't I stop here and take questions?
What is considered doing away with the SAT scores?
Microphone.
How do you feel about that?
Repeat the question.
I can repeat it.
Yeah.
UC is thinking of getting rid of SAT scores. What do I think about that? Well, it's a bad idea. The whole debate over the SAT has become part, I think, of the whole racial politics. It's become a controversial issue mainly because of its racially disparate effect. Now, I certainly don't think that the SAT is the only predictor of success. If you take people's GPAs in California public schools and you adjust for the difficulty of the class and things like that, it's as good a predictor, sometimes a better predictor than SAT. But throwing away information is never a good idea. And university admissions officers don't have any incentive to throw information away, right? They have an incentive to come up with an algorithm within other constraints that they have to maximize student performance.
What about the LSAT year score?
Yeah, there's a similar motion, folks, in the 15 years since I wrote my article, no one has come up with an alternate explanation for the findings about huge disparities in bar passage. The response instead is, as I've said, high integration, and then also attack the idea of performance standards. So there's a big move to either get rid of the bar or dramatically lower the score you need to pass. My law school and most other law schools have repeatedly eased up their curves so that, without telling employers, so that what was a B student is now an A- student. They've pretty much eliminated failing from school or probation. So, which means that more students go all the way through. It used to be that like 10% of our students were kicked out after the first year because they had bad grades. Now all those students are passed. They pay the full 3 years of tuition. They have $200,000 in debt, and then they fail the bar exam over and over again. Right? I mean, it's such an outrageous breach of fiduciary duty, I think, that, among other things. So it's like kill the messenger. If there's something that's showing a disparity, then it must be bad. Yeah. You.
I have a microphone.
Okay, go ahead.
Excuse me. To me, this is infuriating to begin with. If I were a minority student, I would be humiliated and disgusted with that. But that's me. How do you feel about Harvard having separate graduations for blacks and whites, and it's initiated by black students?
Well, if you think about the whole mismatch thing as just kind of a phenomenon, right? What would we expect to happen? Well, we would expect that a school that's using really large preferences is going to have two big effects. One is that majority students, although they won't say so, will tend to form negative stereotypes of minority students. Because they'll see minority students academically struggling in the classroom and various other things. It's just kind of, they're going to be underrepresented in all academic achievement, which is kind of creating a microcosm of really bad race relations on the campus. And among the minority students themselves, there's going to be a feeling of separation. Like, my black friends and I are all not doing well. This must be because the school is discriminating against me. So it creates a desire to pull away, to have safe spaces, to have your own fraternity house, your own dorm, and your own graduation. So all this is doing the exact opposite of what we wanted to do in the 1960s when we got rid of race as a criteria.
Is diversity a positive good? That is, it seems to me that the argument is, irrespective of all the statistics you put up, in the society we live in, we have to have a diverse representation in the profession, especially in the legal profession. And the second part is, does your statistics reinforce or affect group IQ? That is, blacks traditionally have suffered historically under a feeling, or at least a feeling of inferiority. That is, the rest of the field. Historically, blacks were, quote, inferior, so therefore your studies reinforce the feelings of black inferiority. How do you answer those questions?
Well, those are both good questions. The first thing I'd say is that the existence of those two issues, especially the second one.
I'm sorry?
The existence of those two issues, especially the second one, makes it very easy for people who don't want to talk about mismatch to just say, this is racism. And of course, if you think it's racist, you really haven't heard anything that I've said today, right? And I know you're not saying that. But a big problem that's existed in the debate is the ease with which people can say, well, this is actually really an argument about racial inferiority. And ironically, the term racism in our society has become sort of the moral equivalent of what racial epithets used to be. Kind of just a one-word description that puts you in a class of inferiority. You must be mentally incompetent, because there are two things that I interpret as racist. So, to go back to your two arguments, let me start with the second one about IQ. So, the first point is that all this research is showing that race does not predict these bad outcomes. We know, for example, that there's a really large racial disparity in the bar passage. And for years, there was no explanation of what was causing that. My research shows that when you take into account people's entering credentials and the mismatch effect, it explains 100% of that disparity. So it's showing that race does not explain things. So similarly, there's a Harvard economist named Roland Fryer who did some work with the guy who wrote for economics, Steve Levitt. They did a study where they found very good data on early childhood and test score outcomes. They found that the black-white disparity in test scores can actually be fully explained by 7 environmental factors. When you control for these factors, blacks and whites had the same outcomes. So what were they? Well, one was socioeconomic status. Another was birth weight. There's a big problem with prenatal health in the African American community. If you have lower birth weight, that affects your eventual test score ability. There's a big difference in how many books are in the house. There's a big difference in our bedtime strictly enforced. How many hours a day is the television on? When you control for these environmental factors, the race goes away. It's also true that when you look at, in my other work on housing segregation, we found that as cities become more racially integrated, and the schools become more racially integrated, and that really happens, it's not sort of it's a real outgrowth of where people are living and not a result of busing. Test scores converge. Black-white test score gap gets smaller and smaller. If you look across societies, you find that African Americans in West Indies and Africa do better than African Americans raised in the United States. The test score gaps are different. So there's lots and lots of evidence that there's not a genetic basis for this. Your other question was about diversity and the intrinsic value of it. So part of the answer is, a really important part of the answer, is that if you want diversity in the society, then don't create a mismatch at the college level. Because the number of lawyers who pass the bar is going to be higher if you eliminate mismatch. The number of scientists who get PhDs, who are African American or Hispanic, is going to be higher if you get rid of mismatch. You'll have a more diverse society if you do those things. But in general, I think that creating highly artificial environments of diversity where you have radically different standards to get that sort of effect will tend in most places to have very counterproductive effects, whether it's the workplace or higher education. And my research has shown it happens in higher education, but I suspect that the same is true in other environments. Yeah.
So could you speak about?
Nice to repeat the question.
Could you speak on to the Asian American student lawsuit against Harvard?
Yeah.
Looking at some of those numbers, I'm wondering what you think.
Okay, good. So the question on that is how much time do we have? We're going to wrap up around 3. Is that the idea? Okay. All right. So I have a fair amount of time. Okay. Good. So people are generally interested in hearing about Harvard? All right. Yeah. Okay. So this was arguably the most powerful piece of evidence in the Harvard case. So the Harvard suit for background was filed in fall of 2014 by a group called Students for Fair Admissions. Students for Fair Admissions now has about 20,000 members, overwhelmingly Asian American. But this is a carefully crafted lawsuit. There's a man named Edward Bloom, who I consider a friend, who organized this. So this was not spontaneously brought by the Asian American community. Edward Bloom had brought Fisher Action before, he brought other civil rights actions. He's a consistently conservative voice, so he and I disagree on a lot of issues, but I respect all of the things that he does. Anyway, he brought this suit, he's raised money for it, and he's created this organization that has a huge number of members in it. Discovery in the case started in 2015, and the trial was in October of 2018. And the lower court decision came out I think it was this past September, or early October. It's on appeal to the First Circuit. And everyone's assumption, Edwards, Harvard, so on, was that this is going to go higher, that probably will go to the Supreme Court. Anyway, this was perhaps the most single-handed piece of evidence that Harvard produced. This is from a study that Harvard did in 2013, a private study. This only came out through discovery. The title of the study was, "Does Harvard Discriminate Against Asian Americans?" And it was great of Harvard to produce the report. I mean, they didn't burn it. However, the conclusion of this report was missing. We don't know what happened to the conclusion. But there was a table near the end of the report that sort of summarized what they found. And essentially what they found was that if Harvard admitted based only on academic performance, then 43% of the undergraduate would be Asian American. In reality, 18.7% were African American, were Asian American. If you took into account their legacy, their preference for people whose parents and grandparents went to Harvard, or their athletic preferences, then the Asian percentage went down to 31%. If you took into account extracurricular things, which of course is subjective, but they came up with some way of weighting that. They said, well, if you did that, Asians would be 26%. Then if you take into account race, it goes down to 18%. So this is basically documenting very clearly the size of Harvard's racial preferences. So the amazing thing about the decision is that the judge managed to look past evidence like this. So in the case, there were sort of three important parts. There was testimony by various Harvard officials. There was testimony by an expert hired by plaintiffs. Another friend of mine, economist named Peter Sidiakono. He had been one of the colleagues with whom I got the UC data in 2007. And an expert named David Card, who teaches at Berkeley, who testified for Harvard. And if you read the court's opinion, the court basically, its methodology is, well, wherever David Card and the university officials agreed, that's my holding. Essentially disregarded everything that Peter testified on. Now, the woman who covered the Harvard case for the New York Times is a very good education reporter called Anna Horse-Collis. You've probably all read her articles about genocide. As far as I can tell, she had no particular ideology. But she called me up after the trial was over. She said, asked me what I thought. We talked about it for a while. She said, well, I polled all the reporters, and almost all of them found Peter to be a credible witness, and David Card, a Harvard witness, to not be a credible witness. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement. And this is a pretty powerful statement. I mean, how could you find that there's not any racial bias going on when you've got an internal report like that?
Where did it 17 or 18%?
What do you mean?
You only add up to 82%.
Oh, this doesn't include international students. Okay. So, the sort of the substantive issue at Harvard, a lot of what the fight was about, there were sort of two big fights. One was, should you separate out legacy and athletic ambitions from regular ambitions? If you don't separate them out, the Asian effective look is bad. Because as you saw in this table, part of what's going on is that Asians don't do as well in the legacy and athletic pools. And Card and the university argue that everything should be considered together. All ambitions were holistic. Peter pointed out that if you were in a legacy category, instead of having a 4% chance of admission, you had a 35% chance of admission. And so it was clearly a whole different system. And if you were identified as a promising athlete, you had a 90 to 100% chance of admission. So that was one big debate. The other big debate was about the personal ratings. I don't know if you remember any of this, but it turned out that Harvard gave very bad personal ratings to Asian Americans in general. And there was a lot of discussion about, well, Harvard seems to be guilty of racial stereotypes. Like, they don't like quiet violin players or something. And if you, so we tried to analyze this and see what was going on. And this table is showing the proportion of students who got academic ratings by race. And 1 or 2 were really high ratings that usually got you in. 3 was a so-so rating, and 4 or higher was not very good. You can see Asian Americans, this orange bar, were doing really well. Really high performance there. But the interesting thing to look at is this pattern across the 4 groups. Okay? Asians did best. And think about the whole mismatch thing as just kind of a phenomenon, right? What would we expect to happen? Well, we would expect that a school that's using really large preferences is going to have 2 big effects. One is that majority students, although they won't say so, will tend to form negative stereotypes of minority students. Because they'll see minority students academically struggling in the classroom and various other things. It's just kind of, they're going to be underrepresented in all academic achievement, which is kind of creating a microcosm of really bad race relations on the campus. And among the minority students themselves, there's going to be a feeling of separation. Like, my black friends and I are all not doing well. This must be because the school is discriminating against me. So it creates a desire to pull away, to have safe spaces, to have your own fraternity house, your own dorm, and your own graduation. So all this is doing the exact opposite of what we wanted to do in the 1960s when we got rid of race as a criteria.
Is diversity a positive good? That is, it seems to me that the argument is, irrespective of all the statistics you put up, in the society we live in, we have to have a diverse representation in the profession, especially in the legal profession. And the second part is, does your statistics reinforce or affect group IQ? That is, blacks traditionally have suffered historically under a feeling, or at least a feeling of inferiority. That is, the rest of the field. Historically, blacks were, quote, inferior, so therefore your studies reinforce the feelings of black inferiority. How do you answer those questions?
Well, those are both good questions. The first thing I'd say is that the existence of those 2 issues, especially the second one,
I'm sorry?
the existence of those 2 issues, especially the second one, makes it very easy for people who don't want to talk about mismatch to just say, this is racism. And of course, if you think it's racist, you really haven't heard anything that I've said today, right? And I know you're not saying that. But a big problem that's existed in the debate is the ease with which people can say, well, this is actually really an argument about racial inferiority. And ironically, the term racism in our society has become sort of the moral equivalent of what racial epithets used to be. Kind of just a one-word description that puts you in a class of inferiority. You know, you must be mentally incompetent because there are 2 things that I interpret as racist. So, to go back to your 2 arguments, let me start with the second one about IQ. So, the first point is that all this research is showing that race does not predict these bad outcomes. We know, for example, that there's a really large racial disparity in the bar of passage. And for years, there was no explanation of what was causing that. My research shows that when you take into account people's entry credentials and the mismatch effect, it explains 100% of that disparity. So it's showing that race does not explain things. So similarly, there's a Harvard economist named Roland Fryer who did some work with the guy who wrote Freakonomics, Steve Levitt. They did a study where they found very good data on early childhood and test score outcomes. They found that the black-white disparity in test scores can actually be fully explained by 7 environmental factors. When you control for these factors, blacks and whites had the same outcomes. So what were they? Well, one was socioeconomic status. Another was birth weight. There's a big problem with prenatal health in the African American community. If you have lower birth weight, that affects your eventual test score ability. There's a big difference in how many books are in the house. There's a big difference in our bedtime strictly enforced. How many hours a day is the television on? When you control for these environmental factors, the price goes away. It's also true that when you look at, well, in my other work on housing segregation, we found that as cities become more racially integrated, and the schools become more racially integrated, and that really happens, it's not sort of it's a real outgrowth of where people are living and not a result of busing. Test scores converge. Black-white test score gap gets smaller and smaller. If you look across societies, you find that African Americans in West Indies and Africa do better than African Americans raised in the United States. The test score gaps are different. So there's lots and lots of evidence that there's not a genetic basis for this. Your other question was about diversity and the intrinsic value of it. So part of the answer is, a really important part of the answer, is that if you want diversity in the society, then don't create mismatch at the college level. Because the number of lawyers who pass the bar is going to be higher if you eliminate mismatch. The number of scientists who get PhDs, who are African American or Hispanic, is going to be higher if you get rid of mismatch. You'll have a more diverse society if you do those things. But in general, I think that creating highly artificial environments of diversity where you have radically different standards to get that sort of effect will tend in most places to have very counterproductive effects, whether it's the workplace or higher education. And my research has shown it happens in higher education, but I suspect that the same is true in other environments. Yeah.
So could you speak about?
I can repeat the question.
Could you speak on to the Asian American student, lawsuit against Harvard,
Yeah.
looking at some of those numbers? I'm wondering what you think.
Okay, good. So the question on that is, how much time do we have? We're going to wrap up around 3, is that the idea? Okay, all right, so I have a fair amount of time. Okay, good. So people are generally interested in hearing about Harvard? All right. Yeah. Okay. So this was arguably the most powerful piece of evidence in the Harvard case. So the Harvard suit for background was filed in fall of 2014 by a group called Students for Fair Admissions. Students for Fair Admissions now has about 20,000 members, overwhelmingly Asian American. But this is a carefully crafted lawsuit. There's a man named Edward Bloom, who I consider a friend, who organized this. So this was not spontaneously brought by the Asian American community. Edward Bloom had brought Fisher Action before, he brought other civil rights actions. He's a consistently conservative voice, so he and I disagree on a lot of issues, but I respect all of the things that he does. Anyway, he brought this suit, he's raised money for it, and he's created this organization that has a huge number of members in it. Discovery in the case started in 2015, and the trial was in October of 2018. And the lower court decision came out I think it was this past September, or early October. And it's on appeal to the First Circuit. And everyone's assumption, Edwards, Harvard, so on, is that this is going to go higher, but probably in the vote of the Supreme Court. Anyway, this was perhaps the most single-handed piece of evidence that Harvard produced. This is from a study that Harvard did in 2013, a private study. This only came out through discovery. The title of the study was, "Does Harvard Discriminate Against Asian Americans?" And it was great of Harvard to produce the report. I mean, they didn't burn it. However, the conclusion of this report was missing. We don't know what happened to the conclusion. But there was a table near the end of the report that sort of summarized what they found. And essentially what they found was that if Harvard admitted, based only on academic performance, then 43% of the undergraduate would be Asian American. In reality, 18.7% were Asian American. If you took into account their legacy, their preference for people whose parents and grandparents went to Harvard, or their athletic preferences, then the Asian percentage went down to 31%. If you took into account extracurricular things, which of course is subjective, but they came up with some way of weighting that. They said, well, if you did that, Asians would be 26%. Then if you take into account race, it goes down to 18%. So this is basically documenting very clearly the size of Harvard's racial preferences. So the amazing thing about the decision is that the judge managed to look past evidence like this. So in the case, there were sort of three important parts. There was testimony by various Harvard officials. There was testimony by an expert hired by plaintiffs. Another friend of mine, economist named Peter Sidiakono. He had been one of the colleagues with whom I got the UC data in 2007. And an expert named David Card, who teaches at Berkeley, who testified for Harvard. And if you read the court's opinion, the court basically, its methodology is, well, wherever David Card and the university officials agreed, that's my holding. Essentially disregarded everything that Peter testified on. Now, the woman who covered the Harvard case for the New York Times is a very good education reporter called Anna Horsecolas. You've probably all read her articles about genocide. As far as I can tell, she had no particular ideology. But she called me up after the trial was over. She said, asked me what I thought. We talked about it for a while. She said, well, I polled all the reporters, and almost all of them found Peter to be a credible witness, and David Card, the Harvard witness, to not be a credible witness. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement. And this is a pretty powerful statement. I mean, how could you find that there's not any racial bias going on when you've got an internal report like that?
Where did the 17 or 18%?
What do you mean?
You go add up to 82%.
Oh, this doesn't include international students. Okay. So, the sort of the substantive issue at Harvard, a lot of what the fight was about, there were sort of two big fights. One was, should you separate out legacy and athletic ambitions from regular ambitions? If you don't separate them out, the Asian effect didn't look as bad. Because as you saw in this table, part of what's going on is that Asians don't do as well in the legacy and athletic pools. And Card and the university argue that everything should be considered together. All ambitions were holistic. Peter pointed out that if you were in a legacy category, instead of having a 4% chance of admission, you had a 35% chance of admission. And so it was clearly a whole different system. And if you were identified as a promising athlete, you had a 90 to 100% chance of admission. So that was one big debate. The other big debate was about the personal ratings. I don't know if you remember any of this, but it turned out that Harvard gave very bad personal ratings to Asian Americans in general. And there was a lot of discussion about, well, Harvard seems to be guilty of racial stereotypes. Like, they don't like quiet violin players or something. And if you, so we tried to analyze this and see what was going on. And this table is showing the proportion of students who got academic ratings by race. And 1 or 2 were really high ratings that usually got you in. 3 was a so-so rating, and 4 or higher was not very good. You can see Asian Americans, this orange bar, were doing really well. Really high performance there. But the interesting thing to look at is this pattern across the 4 groups. Okay? Asians did best, then whites, then Hispanics, then African Americans. If you look at the personal ratings that Harvard gave, it's the mirror image. Students who got the highest personal ratings were African American, then Hispanics, then whites, then Asians. So if you add these two together, voila, they cancel out. And Peter said, well, you know, if you try to figure out, if you try to use regression analysis to predict people's personal ratings, there's a really artificial effect. So you should take into account, by all means, all the stuff people put in their applications about their achievements and their, you know, their community service and their extracurriculars. But you shouldn't count Harvard's actual score because that's part of the discrimination. So after the case, I went to UCLA, which also used to give a personal rating before they went through sort of this holistic admissions process. This is what this is what the UCLA personal ratings look like. In the top decile, you can see race doesn't matter that much. This is before UCLA went to holistic admissions. Pretty much all the groups who have good academics have good personal ratings. But Asian Americans, by a small margin, have the best. The opposite of what Harvard data showed. But in any case, all the ratings went down a lot as your academic performance went down. Personal accomplishment turns out to be highly correlated with academic accomplishment. But as you can see at Harvard, it wasn't correlated at all. The personal accomplishments of African Americans who were in the 7th decile was much, much higher than the personal accomplishments of Asians in the top decile. So is it conceivable that this is not discrimination? Just give you one more example, and then I think that'll kind of cover the Harvard issue. This was an analysis, one of the analyses presented by David Card. And this was kind of a funny, you know, if you're an empiricist, this will be funnier than if you're not. But he was trying to show that race is not important in admissions decisions. So he took a bunch of things that Harvard had in its files, and he saw, how well can we predict your probability of being admitted to the admissions pool if we just look at this one set of characteristics. So if you looked at all the profile ratings, you can come up with a really high prediction. If you looked at guidance and counselor ratings, pretty good. Well, I'm not interviewed and so on. But if you only looked at race, it didn't predict anything. In other words, if you looked at the Harvard admissions files, and you looked at them all the domestic ones, and you just put race into the equation, how much did that predict of the admissions? Essentially nothing. So, how could that be true? It could be true under two circumstances. One circumstance is if there's really no difference between students across races by anything that Harvard cares about. The second possibility is that Harvard has a proportional quota, that they admit 6% of every racial group. If you have a quota, you'll get this result. Race will fall out because every group will have a 6% chance of admission. Okay? So how do you tell between those two theories? You see whether or not race is correlated with any of these other things. And as you can see from the earlier two slides, race is very correlated at Harvard with personal rating, and it's very correlated at Harvard with academic rating. So again, that seems to be by itself to win the case for students with fair admissions. So this is going to go up on appeal. We'll see what the First Circuit says, and then we'll see if the Supreme Court makes a decision.
A lot of us went to elite colleges, and there's a TED Talk where he suggested you go to a less elite college because you're more likely to write a paper after you graduate if you're a STEM category. So would you apply this advice generally? How widely would you say it's a smart thing to not be so aspirational about choosing a college?
Yeah, good point. So is that, you refer to that literature on the economists that they did? That the economists who went to sort of second-tier schools had a better publication record, given their credentials? Yeah, it's a great paper. Yeah, I do think, this sort of goes to like the admission scandal and all this other stuff. I mean, the mismatch is a particular outlier, extreme phenomenon. I think in general, we are way, way too preoccupied with school eliteness. This idea that you apply to 20 schools and then you get into the one that's most elite that accepts you, I think is a bad strategy. I think you want to go to a school where you're going to be in the middle of the class or maybe a little better. And, you know, I mean, the research on this is not very sensitive. That study that you cited is very suggestive, I think. But like, you know, my son, when he applied to college, he's half African American, by the way. He got into stronger schools than what we eventually went to. But our advice and his inclination was to go to University of Washington, which was about in the middle of the pack of what accepted him. And that turned out really well because, you know, he ended up with about a 3.4 for his GPA. If he had gone to a stretch school or a school where he had a large preference, he would have much lower grades. Those grades were good enough that when he decided he wanted to become a veterinarian, he went back and took some science courses. He was more motivated. He got A's in all those. So his overall average was about 3.6. And that was good enough to get into vet school. And, you know, and I'm sure that would have happened at all if he'd gone to a stretch school. So this whole idea of trying to jigger the system to get into a marginal more elite school is crazy, I think.
I had a question about the social mismatch. So you showed how, as a result, the different levels of academic success would pair and that thereby lower their achievement.
Yep.
And I wondered if there were any studies about pairing the lower achievement levels with the higher achieving students. I know they are doing this currently at Berkeley High School. Any studies to show the success of that approach?
So I'm not sure I understand. You're talking about pairing who with who?
A high achieving student with a lesser achieving student in the classroom.
Yeah, that's basically what this study was. Well, this study was making the roommates at the Air Force Academy and finding the lower achieving students were hurt. Now in the classroom, I mean, as I mentioned to some of you before the talk, I got into all this because I was doing research on academic support. A colleague of mine at UCLA asked me to help, and little did I know where this would lead, but that was almost 30 years ago. And we had 7 different types of academic support programs at UCLA, and we found 2 of them worked, 5 of them didn't. And those wonderful early days, you know, the dean and the faculty got this report, they discussed it, and they filled those 5 bad programs. You know, the form of academic support that we found most effective was where you had a teacher who was teaching a substantive class, but they were continually focusing and helping the students think about what the learning process was and conceptualize the learning process. And that made people introspective enough about their habits that they developed better methods of teaching themselves. That worked. Whereas student tutoring didn't work that well, pairing up students with professors and giving them extra help, that didn't work that well. You know, there's a lot of things where people just, contact by itself, I don't think does much in terms of academic support. You really have to have a theory as to how you're going to change people's learning process. Okay, have I worn you out? Yeah.
What about excellence? And I mean by that, the Tuskegee Airmen, who were initially the Army Air Corps position was that blacks couldn't be fighter pilots because they didn't have the intellectual ability to fly a plane. And then they changed that and they picked the Tuskegee Airmen, who were superb, the top physically, intellectually, psychologically, a really select group of people. They were in Italy, and you could see the results almost instantaneously. They had on their planes red tails. If you flew with the red tails, and they were protecting the bombers, you could count how many bombers went out and how many bombers came back. And they began to get requests from the white bomber pilots, because I don't think there were any black bomber pilots, to fly with the red tails, because you came back alive if you flew with the red tails. Is there any concept to get the minority community a reputation for excellence? that if you have a black lawyer, you have an excellent lawyer. If you have a Hispanic lawyer, you have an excellent lawyer. Is that anywhere around in the academic circles or school circles?
Well, no, because the ideology is to try to, preference system creates patterns that are the opposite of what you're describing. I don't know about this speaking but if you have a really segregated system and then you say, okay, we're going to open the door a crack, you probably are going to get an extraordinary group, right? It's going to outperform all the others because they're the best of their group. I mean, that's not an hypothesis. But we've created a system where we downplay the role of academics and admissions as it pertains to race. And ends up creating a system that guarantees that the average African American at an elite school will be doing worse on average than their white classmates. And it's an average. We have big standard errors in these estimates. It's only an average, but that's going to foster the opposite of the stereotype that we want to foster, right? We want to foster the idea that, this African American doctor must be superb because they got into a system that had no preference, and they probably overcame some obstacles in the way. Actually, I do know something that goes to your point, which is that a lot of critics of my reports when they came out initially said, research like this is going to dampen African American interest in going to law school. And we decided that the Prop 209 experience in California should provide a good natural experiment. And we looked at what happened to African American applicants and Latino applicants to the university. I've already shown you that the numbers of Black and Hispanic applicants went up. It turns out that when you control for people's high school characteristics, minority students became more likely to apply to UC after UC went race neutral. And the size of the increase was exactly correlated with how aggressive the preferences had been before Prop 209. So there was a dramatic, Berkeley had the largest preferences, and then UCLA. There was a huge jump in minorities accepting Berkeley offers after race neutrality started. And to me, the obvious explanation is there were a lot of highly able Black and Hispanic students who said, I want to go to a place where no one's going to assume I got in because of my race. That will create a better environment for me, and it will create a more valuable degree, because no one will assume this is a Black Berkeley degree, just a Berkeley degree. Yeah.
Forget about the law schools. We have too many attorneys as there are now. If you work on the assumption that education is the key to lifting everybody up, I haven't heard what you would recommend to get more minorities involved in higher education. I hear about the preferences, this, that, and the other thing, but what tangible thing can we do, recognizing as a society, unless we bring these people up, we're going to be constantly fighting this battle? The statistics didn't indicate that to me, at least.
Okay, well, part of what I just said is on point, which is that if you convince people that the system is race neutral, then that by itself will increase minority applications and acceptances. So that's important. Berkeley, Black acceptances went up 15%. That's not a small effect. Secondly, you saw that in UC, the number of African Americans and Hispanics enrolling went up because schools were forced to use real outreach programs to identify promising students instead of just admitting using whatever preference size they needed to get the racial makeup they wanted. So I think those examples are both directly on point for you. Well, and the other thing we could do, that I like us to do, is substantially reduce housing segregation. Because that's the big thing in America that's driving these disparities in the first place. And you can actually address housing segregation and deal with a big swath of the population much more efficiently than you can do it through these really indirect, counterproductive means.
three that you haven't mentioned yet, one that I actually affected myself. I went to Cornell for many years
Okay?
and many degrees. One that I affected right away on graduation was the 5-year engineering program. I got it changed to 4 years just by mentioning to them that outside people, like from MIT, would come to Cornell. I sit next to a good friend of mine under these circumstances. We both got A's in the graduate program. I got a 5-year bachelor's degree. He got a 4-year bachelor's degree from MIT. And a master's degree is 5th year, getting the same grades, same background, all that. So I brought that up to the dean. I was a biggie in the alumni group. And it changed. Right the next year, thereafter, a teacher in the UCLA school.
So what's your question?
Okay, the question is, since I could do it as not an academic, not a lawyer and things like that, that's one way to get change, to show that a university was unfair on how it was using its 5th year for graduate students and 5th year for bachelor students. The second thing, which you haven't mentioned at all, is the tendency, a good tendency nowadays, to have schools open in the pre-kindergarten level for ages 3 and 4. Okay, I think that is very highly, and that certainly has been a big effect on minority education in our nation. Fourth, the last thing is something you haven't mentioned, which I came across in Ivy League schools. Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an academic background and all that. I have lots of other good things to say. But is the happy bottom quarter, where admissions are based on the fact that if athletes are almost virtually assured of graduating in 4 years, they'll be a happy bottom quarter if they finish in the bottom quarter with valedictorian.
We need to have a question.
Okay, all right. Well, these are questions which have to do with the subject, which have not been mentioned, which are...
Okay, well, why don't I try to talk about those things. So the last question, I think, is, are athletes hurt by mismatch? And I sort of the implication of your comment is they're not so much. That's probably true. It's hard to compare mismatch for athletes for 2 reasons. One is that the data that we get from the schools generally is not broken out by any sense. In fact, never in my experience. So it's hard to separate out that cohort. And secondly, athletes, the high-profile athletes who get recruited, have all these other characteristics that give them high chance of succeeding in their careers. So it's very hard to sort of do an apples-to-apples comparison with other students who didn't get a preference. You also raised pre-K education. And yeah, I think pre-K education is catching on. It can be very effective. The research to me indicates strongly that desegregation of housing markets is more powerful than pre-K or any other sort of social service intervention, because you want to really change the environment of locality.
Thank you, Professor Sander, but we've reached the end of our time. Thank everybody for coming.